During the 1930s and 1940s, American grandparents survived on vegetable dinners that cost less than $1. Dinners made from garden vegetables, humble roots, and whatever the land could provide. Foraged from fields, grown in poverty, and stretched to feed entire families. By 1960, all 30 had disappeared forever. Number 1 uses a root vegetable nobody knows today. Number 7 fries vegetables into golden cakes. Number 24 combines 5 different roots in one pot. Now we are rediscovering these 30 forgotten vegetable dinners that kept grandparents alive through America's toughest years. Salsify root stew was one of the rarest Depression-era dinners because most Americans had never seen this unusual vegetable. Salsify, also called oyster plant or vegetable oyster, grew wild along roadsides and in abandoned fields during the 1930s. The long white root tastes faintly like oysters when cooked, which is why poor families harvested it as a free meat substitute. To make the stew, grandmothers peeled and chopped salsify roots into chunks, then boiled them with onions, potatoes, and any available vegetables in salted water for about 40 minutes until tender. The finished stew had a creamy, slightly sweet flavor that filled empty stomachs for mere pennies. Salsify grew abundantly across rural America, but required knowledge to identify and harvest safely. By the 1950s, when supermarkets replaced foraging, salsify disappeared from American kitchens entirely. Today, most people have never tasted this Depression staple that once saved countless families from starvation. Mangelwurzel and onion stew represented true desperation cooking during the Great Depression. Mangelwurzels were massive yellow or orange root vegetables, originally grown as cattle feed, not human food. When money vanished and grocery stores became unaffordable, desperate families began cooking the same vegetables they fed their livestock. The roots grew to enormous sizes, sometimes weighing 15 to 20 pounds each, providing massive quantities of food for almost no cost. Grandmothers peeled away the thick outer skin, then chopped the pale flesh into cubes and boiled it with sliced onions, salt and pepper for nearly an hour until the tough root softened. The resulting stew tasted bland and slightly bitter, but it kept families alive when nothing else was available. Eating cattle feed carried social shame, so most families never spoke about it publicly. After the Depression ended, Mangelwurzel cultivation for human consumption stopped completely. These giant roots now exist only in agricultural history books. Vegetable loaf became a life-saving Depression dinner when meat disappeared from family tables entirely. This dense, savory loaf combined mashed lima beans, grated carrots, chopped onions, and breadcrumbs into a mixture that baked into a sliceable main dish. Families shaped the vegetable mixture into a loaf pan, then baked it at moderate heat for about 45 minutes until a golden crust formed on top. The loaf sliced cleanly like meatloaf, making it feel more substantial than simple boiled vegetables. Some cooks added tomato sauce on top for extra flavor and moisture. The finished dish provided protein from beans and vitamins from carrots, while costing only about 20 cents to feed an entire family. Vegetable loaf appeared frequently in wartime rationing cookbooks during World War II, when meat rationing forced creativity. After rationing ended and affordable meat returned to stores, vegetable loaf vanished from American dinner tables. Most people today have never heard of this meatless main dish. Parsnip and turnip casserole combined 2 forgotten root vegetables into one hearty Depression dinner. Both parsnips and turnips grew easily in poor soil and stored well through harsh winters, making them essential survival crops for struggling families. Cooks peeled and diced both vegetables into uniform chunks, then layered them in a baking dish with sliced onions, a small amount of butter or lard, salt, pepper, and just enough water to prevent burning. The casserole baked slowly in a moderate oven for about 90 minutes, until the vegetables turned tender and slightly caramelized. The parsnips contributed natural sweetness, while turnips added a peppery bite, creating a balanced flavor profile. This simple dish cost about 15 cents and fed a family of 6. After World War II ended, modern supermarkets began importing more exotic vegetables year-round. Parsnips and turnips fell out of favor as old-fashioned poverty food. Today, most Americans have never tasted either vegetable.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Wild chicory and potato stew required foraging knowledge that most modern Americans have completely lost. Chicory grew wild in fields, along roadsides, and in abandoned lots throughout the Depression era. The bitter greens were free for anyone willing to identify and harvest them correctly. Grandmothers gathered the young chicory leaves in early spring before they became too tough and bitter, then combined them with diced potatoes, onions, and water in a large pot. The mixture simmered for about 30 minutes until potatoes softened and chicory wilted down. Salt and pepper provided the only seasoning most families could afford. The finished stew tasted sharply bitter from the chicory, but the potatoes helped mellow the intense flavor. This dinner cost only about 12 cents, with the potatoes and onions being the only purchased ingredients. After the Depression ended, foraging for wild greens carried stigma as poverty behavior. Chicory knowledge disappeared within one generation. Today, the plant grows everywhere, but almost nobody recognizes it. 5 forgotten vegetable dinners down. Salsify roots foraged from roadsides. Mangelwurzels borrowed from cattle troughs. Vegetable loaves shaped like meat. Parsnip casseroles baked for hours. Wild chicory gathered from fields. All 5 vanished because they reminded families of hunger and shame. The next 5 disappeared for different reasons altogether. Rutabaga and carrot hash transformed 2 humble root vegetables into a filling Depression dinner. Rutabagas, also called Swedes or yellow turnips, were large, dense roots that stored through entire winters without refrigeration. Cooks peeled both rutabagas and carrots, then diced them into small uniform cubes about ½ an inch across. The vegetables went into a large cast-iron skillet with a small amount of lard or bacon grease, then fried over medium heat for about 30 minutes, stirring frequently to prevent burning. Salt and pepper provided seasoning. The finished hash developed crispy brown edges on the vegetables while keeping the centers tender. Some families added chopped onions for extra flavor. This simple dish cost about 12 cents and provided substantial calories from the starchy rutabaga. After World War II, rutabagas became associated with wartime rationing and poverty. Younger generations rejected them as old-fashioned. By the 1970s, most American grocery stores stopped carrying rutabagas entirely. Fried parsnip cakes required more labor than most Depression dinners, which is exactly why they disappeared so quickly after the war ended. Cooks boiled parsnips until completely soft, then mashed them smooth like potatoes. The mashed parsnips mixed with flour, salt, and just enough water to form a thick dough that could be shaped by hand. Small portions of dough were flattened into patties about 3 inches across and ½ an inch thick. Each patty fried in hot lard or bacon grease for about 4 minutes per side until golden brown and crispy outside. The finished cakes had sweet, nutty flavor from the parsnips and satisfying crunch from frying. A batch cost about 12 cents and fed a family for dinner. But the process took nearly an hour of active cooking time. When women entered the workforce after World War II, time-consuming recipes like this vanished immediately. Modern convenience won. Turnip and potato pie stretched 2 cheap vegetables into a filling main dish that felt more substantial than simple boiled vegetables. Cooks peeled and thinly sliced equal amounts of turnips and potatoes, then layered them in a deep pie dish or casserole, alternating between turnip and potato slices. Each layer got seasoned with salt, pepper, and tiny bits of butter or lard. The assembled pie was covered with a simple crust made from flour, water, and lard, then baked in a moderate oven for about 90 minutes until the vegetables turned tender and the crust browned. Some families added onions between the layers for extra flavor. The finished pie cost about 18 cents and served 6 people. It provided the comfort of pastry without expensive meat filling. After the Depression ended, this humble pie disappeared as families could finally afford real meat pies again. The recipe vanished within 1 generation. Mixed root vegetable casserole represented the ultimate Depression survival strategy of combining whatever vegetables the garden still produced late into winter. Families diced carrots, turnips, parsnips, rutabagas, and potatoes into uniform chunks, then layered them in a large baking dish. A small amount of water, lard, salt, and pepper went over the top. Some cooks added a handful of dried beans if any remained in the pantry. The casserole baked covered in a slow oven for nearly 2 hours until all vegetables turned fork tender. The long cooking time allowed flavors to meld together into one unified dish rather than separate vegetables. This dinner cost about 22 cents because it used so many different vegetables, but it fed large families and provided varied nutrition. After World War II ended, this type of mixed casserole fell out of favor as families preferred vegetables served separately in the modern style. The entire concept disappeared. Dandelion greens and potato soup required foraging knowledge that grandmothers passed down, but younger generations never learned. Early spring dandelion greens, harvested before the plants flowered, were tender and only slightly bitter. Grandmothers gathered several handfuls, then washed them thoroughly to remove dirt and insects. The greens went into a pot with diced potatoes, chopped onions, water, salt and pepper. Everything simmered together for about 25 minutes until potatoes softened and greens wilted completely. Some families added a splash of vinegar to cut the bitterness. The finished soup cost only 10 cents because dandelions were free and potatoes were cheap. It provided essential vitamins when fresh vegetables were unaffordable. After the Depression ended, foraging carried social stigma as poverty behavior. Parents stopped teaching children which wild plants were edible. Within 1 generation, dandelion soup knowledge disappeared completely. Today, dandelions grow everywhere, but almost nobody eats them. 10 forgotten vegetable dinners gone. Rutabaga hash fried until crispy. Parsnip cakes shaped by hand. Turnip pies baked under pastry. Mixed casseroles combining everything. Dandelion soup foraged for free. All 10 vanished when convenience replaced labor and foraging became shameful. The next 10 disappeared even faster. Creamed turnips and peas combined 2 inexpensive vegetables into one dish that felt more elegant than plain boiled vegetables. Turnips grew abundantly in Depression-era gardens because they tolerated poor soil and required almost no care. Peas, whether fresh from the garden in summer or dried and reconstituted in winter, added protein and bright color to the pale turnips. Cooks peeled and diced turnips into half-inch cubes, then boiled them in salted water for about 15 minutes until tender. Meanwhile, peas cooked separately in another pot. Both vegetables drained completely before combining. The cream sauce came together in the same pot used for boiling, made by melting a small amount of butter, stirring in flour to create a roux, then slowly adding milk while whisking constantly to prevent lumps. Salt and pepper provided the only seasonings most families could afford. The cooked turnips and peas folded into the cream sauce, creating a dish that looked and tasted more refined than its 15-cent cost suggested. Some cooks added a pinch of nutmeg if the spice cabinet still held any. The creamy texture made the vegetables more appealing to children who otherwise refused turnips. This dish appeared frequently on Depression dinner tables because it transformed humble ingredients into something that felt special. After World War II ended and meat became affordable again, creamed vegetables fell out of fashion as old-fashioned. The younger generation associated cream sauce with poverty cooking and rejected it. By the 1960s, creamed turnips and peas had vanished from American tables completely, remembered only by the elderly. Cabbage and apple bake created an unusual sweet and savory combination that helped families stomach the endless cabbage that dominated Depression gardens. Cabbage grew easily, stored well, and cost almost nothing, making it a survival staple. But after eating plain boiled cabbage for weeks, families desperately needed variety. Adding apples transformed boring cabbage into something more interesting. Cooks shredded cabbage into thin strips, then layered it in a baking dish with thinly sliced apples, creating alternating layers of each. Some cooks added sliced onions between layers for additional flavor. A tiny amount of sugar, if any remained in the house, got sprinkled over the top, along with salt, pepper, and small dots of lard or butter. The dish baked covered in a moderate oven for about an hour, until both cabbage and apples turned soft and slightly caramelized. The apples released their juices during baking, creating natural sauce that flavored the cabbage. The finished dish cost only 12 cents, because both cabbage and apples were among the cheapest foods available. It tasted simultaneously sweet from apples and savory from cabbage, creating complexity that made the humble ingredients more interesting. Some families ate this as a main dish, while others served it alongside beans or potatoes. After the Depression ended, this combination seemed too poverty-stricken to continue making. The association between cabbage and hard times was so strong that younger generations rejected it entirely. Cabbage and apple bake disappeared within one generation, surviving only in a few handwritten family recipe cards tucked into old cookbooks. Tomato and bread pudding transformed stale bread and canned tomatoes into a filling Depression dinner that cost almost nothing. Bread went stale quickly without modern packaging, and throwing away food was unthinkable during hard times. This savory pudding gave new life to rock-hard bread that was otherwise inedible. Cooks tore stale bread into chunks and placed them in a greased baking dish. A can of tomatoes, or fresh tomatoes if summer garden produce was available, got poured over the bread along with the tomato juice. Chopped onions, salt, pepper, and a tiny bit of sugar to cut the tomato acidity went into the mixture. Some families added dried herbs from the garden if any remained. Everything sat for about 10 minutes to let the bread soak up the tomato juice and soften. Then the dish baked in a moderate oven for approximately 35 minutes until the top turned golden brown and slightly crispy, while the bottom stayed moist and custard-like. The finished pudding cost about 15 cents and fed a family of 6. It provided carbohydrates from bread and vitamins from tomatoes in one simple dish. Some children actually enjoyed this pudding more than plain vegetables. The concept of savory bread pudding felt normal during the Depression, when every scrap of food had value. After the war ended and bread became cheap enough to waste, the entire concept of saving stale bread disappeared. Younger generations found savory bread pudding strange and unappealing. Tomato and bread pudding vanished completely by the 1950s. Corn pudding Depression style bore little resemblance to the rich, custard-based corn puddings served at modern holiday tables. Depression corn pudding contained no eggs, no cream, and very little milk, because those ingredients cost too much. Instead, it relied on corn itself to provide body and flavor. Cooks used either fresh corn cut from the cob in late summer or canned corn during other seasons. The corn went into a bowl with a small amount of flour, Just enough milk to moisten everything. Salt, pepper, and a tiny bit of sugar. Some recipes added cornmeal to thicken the mixture further. The combination stirred together into a thick batter, then poured into a greased baking dish. The pudding baked in a moderate oven for about 40 minutes, until it set firm enough to slice, and the top developed a golden crust. The finished dish was dense and filling, more like cornbread than custard. It cost approximately 15 cents and provided substantial calories from the starchy corn. Families ate this as a main dish, not a side. Children generally liked corn pudding because the subtle sweetness appealed to young palates. The dish appeared frequently on depression tables because corn was one of the most affordable vegetables available. After World War II ended, corn pudding recipes began adding eggs, cream, and butter, transforming it into the rich version known today. The simple provided crucial protein during the Depression, when meat became unaffordable for most families. Lentils cost only a few cents per pound and didn't require the overnight soaking that beans needed, making them faster and more convenient for desperate families. Cooks combined dried lentils with whatever vegetables remained in the root cellar or garden. Typical additions included diced carrots, chopped onions, diced turnips, and cubed potatoes. Everything went into a large pot with water, salt, and pepper. The stew simmered for about 45 minutes, until lentils turned soft and vegetables became tender. Some families added canned tomatoes if any remained in the pantry, creating a reddish broth. Others kept it simple, with just water and vegetables. The finished stew was thick, hearty, and surprisingly filling despite containing no meat whatsoever. It cost approximately 18 cents to feed an entire family. The lentils provided essential protein and iron that children needed for growth. Many immigrant families, particularly those from Mediterranean and Middle Eastern countries, already knew lentil recipes and taught them to their neighbors during hard times. Depression-era lentil stew was plain and simple, seasoned only with salt and pepper because spices were luxury items. After the Depression ended, lentils became associated with poverty and ethnic food, rather than mainstream American cooking. The younger generation rejected lentils entirely, preferring hamburger and other affordable meats. Lentil and vegetable stew disappeared from most American kitchens by the 1960s, surviving only in ethnic communities that maintained their traditional foodways. 15 vegetable dinners erased from history. Creamed turnips that felt elegant. Cabbage baked with apples. Bread pudding made savory. Corn pudding without eggs. Lentil stews providing protein. All 15 vanished when abundance replaced scarcity. The next 5 disappeared even though they actually tasted good. Baked eggplant casserole was one of the few Depression vegetable dinners that families actually enjoyed, rather than merely tolerated. Eggplant grew prolifically in summer gardens, producing enormous quantities of the purple vegetables throughout the growing season. Unlike some Depression foods that tasted bland or bitter, properly cooked eggplant developed rich, meaty flavor that satisfied cravings for more substantial food. Cooks peeled and cubed eggplants, then boiled them in salted water for about 10 minutes until they began to soften. The eggplant drained thoroughly to remove excess water. Meanwhile, breadcrumbs prepared from dried, stale bread, combined with a small amount of melted lard or butter. The cooked eggplant layered into a greased baking dish, seasoned with salt and pepper between each layer. Chopped tomatoes from the garden, if available, went between layers too. Some cooks added sliced onions. The breadcrumb mixture scattered over the top provided a crispy topping. The casserole baked in a moderate oven for approximately 30 minutes until the top turned golden brown and the eggplant became completely tender. The finished dish cost about 18 cents and tasted surprisingly rich despite its simple ingredients. The eggplant's natural texture mimicked meat better than most vegetables. Families who grew eggplant ate this casserole frequently during summer months. However, Eggplant remained unfamiliar to many Americans outside Italian and Mediterranean communities. After the Depression ended, eggplant failed to gain mainstream popularity. The vegetable seemed foreign and strange. Baked eggplant casserole remained an ethnic dish. Rather than becoming American standard, most families never learned to cook it. Cabbage and potato casserole combined the two most common Depression vegetables into one substantial dinner that cost almost nothing. Both cabbage and potatoes stored through entire winters without refrigeration, making them available year-round when fresh vegetables disappeared from markets. Both grew easily in poor soil with minimal care. Together they formed the backbone of Depression survival cooking. Cooks shredded cabbage into thin strips and sliced potatoes into rounds about quarter-inch thick. These layered alternately in a deep baking dish, with cabbage layer, potato layer, cabbage layer, potato layer, continuing until the dish was full. Each layer got seasoned with salt and pepper. Some families added thin-sliced onions between layers for additional flavor. A small amount of water or vegetable cooking liquid poured over everything to prevent burning during the long baking time. The casserole baked covered in a slow oven for approximately 90 minutes until both vegetables turned completely tender. Some cooks removed the cover during the last 15 minutes to brown the top slightly. The finished casserole cost only 15 cents and fed large families adequately. The combination was filling and provided decent nutrition from the vegetables. However, it was undeniably bland and monotonous. Families ate this casserole because they had to, not because they wanted to. After the Depression ended, the sight of cabbage and potatoes together reminded people of hunger and hard times. The younger generation rejected this combination entirely as poverty food. Cabbage and potato casserole disappeared within one generation. Today, the combination seems unappetizing and primitive. Fried green tomatoes with tomato gravy turned end-of-season garden surplus into a Depression dinner that actually tasted delicious. When frost threatened in early fall, tomato plants still held dozens of green tomatoes that would never ripen. Rather than waste them, resourceful cooks created this dish. Green tomatoes sliced into thick rounds about half-inch wide, then dredged in cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper. The coated slices fried in hot lard or bacon grease for about 3 minutes per side until golden brown and crispy outside, while staying firm inside. The green tomatoes had tart, tangy flavor, completely different from ripe red tomatoes. Meanwhile, tomato gravy cooked in a separate pan using canned tomatoes or the last ripe tomatoes from the garden. Flour browned in a small amount of fat created a roux, then tomatoes and water added gradually while stirring constantly to create smooth gravy. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar seasoned the gravy. The fried green tomato slices served hot, with the tomato gravy poured over top, created a complete meal. This dinner cost about 15 cents and provided satisfying flavors and textures. Unlike many Depression foods, people actually looked forward to eating this. The crispy fried coating and tangy tomato flavor made it feel indulgent despite its poverty origins. After the Depression ended, fried green tomatoes survived in Southern cooking, but the tomato gravy version disappeared. Modern versions serve fried green tomatoes as appetizers with remoulade sauce instead. The original Depression preparation vanished completely. Navy bean and onion stew represented Depression cooking at its most basic and survival-focused. Navy beans, small white beans that stored indefinitely when dried, cost only pennies per pound and provided essential protein when meat disappeared from family budgets. The beans required overnight soaking to soften before cooking, which meant families had to plan ahead even when they barely had food. Soaked beans went into a large pot with water, salt, and several onions chopped into chunks. The mixture simmered on low heat for approximately 3 hours until beans turned completely soft and began breaking down, naturally thickening the stew. Some cooks mashed a portion of the beans against the side of the pot to make the broth even thicker and more satisfying. The finished stew was plain, white, and monotonous in flavor, seasoned only with salt, pepper, and onions. No herbs, no tomatoes, no vegetables beyond onions. It cost about 15 cents and provided protein and calories to keep families alive. Children often hated this stew because of its bland, pasty texture and lack of flavor variety. But families ate it multiple times per week because beans were affordable and filling. After the Depression ended, plain navy bean stew became associated with deprivation and poverty. The younger generation rejected it immediately when they could afford more interesting foods. The dish disappeared so completely that by the 1970s, most Americans didn't even recognize navy beans. Modern bean soups contain multiple vegetables, herbs, and ham, bearing no resemblance to the Depression original. After the Depression ended, plain navy bean stew became associated with deprivation and poverty. The younger generation rejected it immediately when they could afford more interesting foods. The dish disappeared so completely that by the 1970s, most Americans didn't even recognize navy beans. Modern bean soups contain multiple vegetables, herbs, and ham, bearing no resemblance to the Depression original. Potato and onion pie stretched two of the cheapest vegetables into a main dish that felt substantial enough to satisfy hungry families. Potatoes and onions both stored well through winter and remained available year-round, even when fresh vegetables vanished from markets completely. This pie elevated them beyond simple boiled vegetables into something that resembled actual cooking. Cooks peeled and thinly sliced potatoes and onions, then arranged them in alternating layers inside a pie dish or deep baking pan. Each layer got seasoned with salt and pepper. A small amount of water poured over the layers prevented burning during baking. Some families added tiny dots of lard or butter between layers if any remained. The assembled pie got covered with a simple pastry crust, made from flour, water, and lard, and baked in a moderate oven for about 75 minutes, until potatoes turned completely tender and the crust browned nicely. The crust created the illusion of something more substantial than plain vegetables. Cutting into the pie and serving wedges made the dinner feel more like a proper meal rather than poverty food. This pie cost approximately 18 cents and fed a family of 6. It provided carbohydrates and decent nutrition from the vegetables. However, it was undeniably monotonous and bland despite the pastry. After the Depression ended, potato and onion pie seemed pointless when families could afford real meat pies again. The recipe disappeared within one generation. Today, almost nobody has heard of this Depression staple that once fed millions. 20 vegetable dinners gone forever. Eggplant baked until tender. Cabbage layered with potatoes. Green tomatoes fried crispy. Navy beans simmered for hours. Potato pies covered with pastry. All 20 vanished when families could finally afford meat again. The final 10 disappeared for completely different reasons. Succotash combined corn and lima beans into one of the few Depression vegetable dinners that survived into modern times, though in drastically different form. The original Depression-era succotash bore little resemblance to the butter-rich side dish served at Thanksgiving tables today. During the 1930s and 1940s, succotash was a main dish, not a side, and it contained no dairy whatsoever, because butter and cream cost too much for struggling families. The name succotash comes from the Narragansett word Mesquitash, meaning boiled corn kernels. Native Americans taught early colonists this combination, and it remained a staple of American cooking for centuries. During the Depression, succotash became survival food because both corn and lima beans were among the cheapest foods available, and both could be dried or canned for year-round availability. Cooks combined corn and lima beans in roughly equal proportions in a large pot with just enough water to prevent burning. Salt and pepper provided the only seasonings most families could afford. The mixture simmered for about 20 minutes until the lima beans turned tender and the corn heated through. Some families used fresh vegetables from summer gardens, while others relied on canned or dried versions during winter months. The finished dish was plain, simple and filling, providing protein from lima beans and carbohydrates from corn. It cost approximately 20 cents to feed an entire family. Depression succotash was eaten as the main dinner, often with only a piece of cornbread on the side. There was no meat, no butter, no cream, no elaborate seasonings, just corn and beans cooked together in water. Children generally tolerated succotash better than many depression foods because the corn added slight sweetness that made the lima beans more palatable. Lima beans alone were despised by most children, but mixed with corn they became acceptable. After World War II ended and rationing ceased, succotash underwent dramatic transformation. Cookbooks began adding butter, cream, peppers, tomatoes, and other vegetables to make it more appealing. It shifted from main dish to side dish as meat returned to American tables. The modern version, served at holiday meals, contains so much butter and cream that it barely resembles the Depression original. However, the Depression Association never quite left succotash. By the 1970s and 1980s, younger generations viewed it as old-fashioned and unappealing. School cafeterias serving succotash became symbols of bad institutional food. The dish developed a reputation as something nobody actually wanted to eat. Even the word succotash became synonymous with old-fashioned, undesirable food. Pinto bean soup sustained countless Depression families through the hardest years, because dried pinto beans cost almost nothing and provided essential protein when meat became unaffordable. A pound of dried pinto beans, costing only 8 to 10 cents in the 1930s, would feed a large family for an entire day when stretched into soup. The beans stored indefinitely without refrigeration, making them one of the most reliable foods during uncertain times. Making pinto bean soup required planning ahead, because dried beans needed overnight soaking to soften before cooking. Families with nothing to eat tomorrow still had to remember to soak beans tonight, which required mental energy that exhaustion and hunger often depleted. The soaked beans went into a large pot with water, salt, and whatever onions the family could spare. Some cooks added a ham bone if any remained from a previous meal, but most Depression pinto bean soup contained no meat whatsoever. The soup simmered on low heat for approximately 3 to 4 hours until beans turned completely soft and began breaking apart, naturally thickening the liquid into proper soup consistency. Some cooks mashed a portion of the beans against the pot's side to make the soup even thicker and more filling. The finished soup was plain, brownish, monotonous, seasoned only with salt and the mild flavor of the beans themselves. No tomatoes, no peppers, no cumin or chili powder, no elaborate seasonings. Just beans, water, onions, salt, and pepper. The soup cost approximately 15 cents to feed an entire family and provided protein and calories necessary for survival. Families ate this soup multiple times per week, sometimes every single day, for weeks at a time when nothing else was available. Children hated the monotony, but ate it because they were hungry. Adults hated it too, but recognized it was keeping their families alive. Cabbage soup represented Depression, cooking at its most stripped down and survival-focused. Cabbage cost almost nothing, grew abundantly even in poor soil, stored through entire winters without refrigeration, and filled stomachs despite providing minimal calories. During the hardest Depression years, cabbage soup appeared on dinner tables multiple times per week because families literally had nothing else. The soup required only the most basic ingredients that even the poorest families could obtain. 1 head of cabbage, chopped into rough chunks, water, salt, pepper. Sometimes an onion if the family had one. That was it. No meat, no potatoes, no carrots, no tomatoes, no beans. Just cabbage and water. The simplicity was born of pure necessity, not culinary choice. Cooks chopped cabbage and placed it in a large pot with enough water to cover. An onion, quartered, went in if available. The mixture came to a boil, then simmered for about 30 to 40 minutes until the cabbage turned soft and the water absorbed cabbage flavor, turning into thin broth. Salt and pepper provided the only seasonings. Some families added a tiny amount of vinegar to cut the cabbage's sulfurous smell and taste. The finished soup was pale green, watery, and tasted overwhelmingly of boiled cabbage. It cost approximately 12 cents to make a large pot, making it one of the cheapest possible dinners. The soup provided some vitamins from the cabbage, but very few calories, leaving families technically fed but still hungry. Children despised cabbage soup because of its strong, unpleasant flavor and the way it made the whole house smell like sulfur while cooking. Vegetable stew combined every root vegetable remaining in the cellar into one pot, representing both resourcefulness and desperation. This was not a carefully planned recipe with specific proportions and ingredients. Instead, it was whatever vegetables the family still had, thrown together in hopes of creating something edible. The stew changed constantly depending on what remained available as winter progressed and supplies dwindled. Typical ingredients included potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and rutabagas, all peeled and chopped into rough chunks. Some families added cabbage, onions, or dried beans if any remained. Everything went into the largest pot the family owned, as winter progressed and supplies dwindled. Typical ingredients included potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and rutabagas, all peeled and chopped into rough chunks. Some families added cabbage, onions, or dried beans if any remained. Everything went into the largest pot the family owned, covered with water and seasoned with salt and pepper. The mixture simmered for approximately 2 hours until all vegetables turned completely tender and began breaking down, creating a thick, chunky stew. The finished stew was brown, dense, and filling, providing carbohydrates from potatoes and nutrition from the various vegetables. It cost approximately 25 cents because it used so many different vegetables, making it one of the more expensive Depression dinners. However, it fed large families for multiple meals because the pot was enormous. Families ate the stew for dinner, then reheated leftovers the next day, sometimes for several days in a row. The stew's flavor depended entirely on which vegetables went into it. Early winter stews with fresh root vegetables tasted sweet and earthy. Late winter stews made from storage vegetables that were beginning to spoil tasted bitter and unpleasant. But families ate it regardless because wasting food was impossible when starvation threatened. This vegetable stew represented efficient use of resources. Nothing was wasted. Vegetable peelings went to chickens or pigs if the family had any. Every edible part of every vegetable went into the stew pot. The cooking liquid became broth, and if any remained after the family finished eating, it became the base for the next day's soup. Children generally tolerated vegetable stew better than many Depression foods because the variety of vegetables created more interesting flavor than single vegetable dishes. The thick, chunky texture felt more substantial than thin soups. However, eating the same stew multiple days in a row quickly became monotonous. After the Depression ended, this type of everything-in-one-pot vegetable stew seemed too poverty-stricken to continue making. The younger generation preferred vegetables served separately in the modern style, rather than thrown together randomly. They associated mixed vegetable stew with scarcity and making do with whatever was available. Modern vegetable stew recipes contain fresh vegetables, herbs, tomatoes, and sometimes meat or vegetable stock made from scratch. They follow specific recipes with measured ingredients and deliberate flavor profiles. The Depression version, whatever root vegetables remained in the cellar, chopped roughly and boiled together, has been completely forgotten. Nobody makes vegetable stew that way anymore. The concept of using whatever remains available, rather than following a specific recipe, has disappeared from American cooking entirely. Depression style bore little resemblance to the sweet, molasses-rich versions served at modern cookouts and barbecues. Depression baked beans contained no pork, no bacon, no molasses, and very little sugar, because those ingredients cost too much for struggling families. The dish, stripped down to its most basic form, dried beans baked slowly until tender, seasoned simply with whatever the family had. Dried navy beans or pea beans, the smallest white beans available, soaked overnight to soften before cooking. The soaked beans went into a heavy pot or bean crock with water, salt, pepper, and perhaps an onion if the family had one. Some cooks added a tiny spoonful of sugar or a drizzle of sorghum molasses, if any remained, but many families had neither. Mustard powder, if available, went in for flavor. That was the entire ingredient list for depression-baked beans. The beans baked in a very slow oven, around 250 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit, for approximately 6 to 8 hours. The long, slow cooking broke down the beans into creamy texture and concentrated the flavors. Families often put the bean pot in the oven early morning and let it cook all day while they worked or searched for employment. The beans required no attention during cooking, making them practical for families dealing with multiple jobs or children. The finished beans were plain, white or pale brown, and simply flavored. They cost approximately 15 cents to make a large pot and provided essential protein when meat was unaffordable. The beans fed families for multiple meals because the pot was large and beans were filling. Some families ate baked beans 3 or 4 times per week during the hardest Depression years. Depression-baked beans appeared in every government nutrition pamphlet and cookbook aimed at economical cooking. Home economists and social workers promoted them as nutritious, economical, and practical. Schools taught girls to make baked beans in home economics classes as essential survival cooking. The dish became so ubiquitous during the Depression that it symbolized the era. However, this also meant baked beans became associated with poverty and hard times. After the Depression ended, recipes immediately began changing. Cookbooks started adding molasses, brown sugar, salt pork, bacon, ketchup, and barbecue sauce to make baked beans more appealing. The dish transformed from plain protein sauce into sweet, rich side dish. 25 forgotten vegetable dinners down. Succotash, eaten as main meals. Pinto bean soup stretched for days. Cabbage soup that smelled like poverty. Vegetable stew made from whatever remained. Baked beans without molasses or pork. All 25 vanished when abundance replaced scarcity. The final 5 disappeared last. Corn fritters transformed leftover corn or cheap canned corn into a Depression dinner that families actually looked forward to eating. Unlike many Depression foods that people ate reluctantly out of necessity, corn fritters tasted good enough that families made them by choice even when other options existed. The fritters felt special and indulgent despite their humble ingredients and low cost. The basic recipe required corn, flour, a small amount of baking powder, salt, and just enough water or milk to create thick batter. Families used fresh corn, cut from the cob during late summer, or canned corn during other seasons. Some recipes called for eggs, but Depression families often omitted them because eggs cost too much or were sold for necessary cash income. The eggless version worked perfectly well, producing fritters that were slightly less rich, but still delicious. Cooks mixed all ingredients together into a thick batter similar to pancake batter, but studded with corn kernels. A large spoonful of batter dropped into hot lard or bacon grease in a cast-iron skillet, then flattened slightly with the back of the spoon. The fritters fried for approximately 3 minutes per side until golden brown and crispy outside, while staying tender inside. Each batch made a satisfying sizzle in the hot fat. The finished fritters cost approximately 15 cents to make enough for a family dinner. They provided carbohydrates from corn and flour, and the frying process added calories from the fat, making them more filling than boiled vegetables. Families ate corn fritters as the main dinner, sometimes with a side of beans or greens if anything else was available. The fritters tasted slightly sweet from the corn and had satisfying crispy texture from frying. Children loved them, which made feeding the family easier during times when children refused to eat yet another meal of boiled vegetables or bean soup. Some families drizzled sorghum molasses over the fritters to make them even more appealing, transforming them into something that felt almost like dessert. Corn fritters appeared frequently in Depression cookbooks and farm journals as economical cooking. The recipe was simple enough that even inexperienced cooks could succeed. The ingredients were basic and cheap. The result tasted good. Everything about corn fritters made them ideal Depression food. However, corn fritters were also fried food, which required fat. As nutrition science advanced in the 1950s and 1960s, fried foods fell out of favor as unhealthy. The younger generation began viewing fried foods as old-fashioned and bad for health. Home cooks stopped frying as much as their mothers and grandmothers had. Lima bean and tomato stew combined two inexpensive ingredients into a Depression dinner that provided protein from beans and vitamins from tomatoes, while costing very little to prepare. Lima beans, also called butter beans, were among the cheapest protein sources available during the Depression. Dried lima beans cost only pennies per pound and stored indefinitely without refrigeration. Tomatoes, whether fresh from summer gardens or canned from previous harvests, added flavor and nutrition to the bland beans. Making the stew required soaking dried lima beans overnight to soften them before cooking. The soaked beans went into a large pot with water and simmered for approximately 90 minutes until they began to soften. Then canned tomatoes or fresh chopped tomatoes added to the pot, along with chopped onions if the family had any. Salt and pepper provided the only other seasonings most families could afford. The mixture continued simmering for another 30 to 40 minutes until the beans turned completely tender and the tomatoes broke down into sauce. The finished stew was thick, reddish-brown, and filling. It cost approximately 18 cents to make enough for a family dinner. The lima beans provided essential protein and calories, while the tomatoes contributed vitamins and made the dish more flavorful than plain beans. The tomato acidity helped cut the starchy, slightly chalky texture that lima beans developed during cooking. Most children hated lima beans in any form. The beans had mealy texture and bland flavor that young palates rejected. However, the tomato sauce made them slightly more tolerable than plain boiled lima beans. Families served lima bean and tomato stew frequently during Depression years because it was nutritious, filling, and economical, regardless of whether children liked it. Some families added whatever other vegetables they had available to make the stew more substantial. Diced carrots, chopped cabbage, or corn kernels stretched the stew further and provided additional nutrition. These additions also helped mask the lima bean flavor that children despised. After World War II ended and meat became affordable again, lima beans fell out of favor dramatically. The beans became associated with institutional cooking, school cafeterias, and poverty food. The younger generation developed intense dislike for lima beans, remembering being forced to eat them during childhood, when nothing else was available. Lima beans became the vegetable that everyone hated. By the 1970s, lima beans had nearly disappeared from American cooking, except in very traditional Southern cuisine. Frozen baby lima beans survived in grocery stores but rarely sold. Lima bean and tomato stew vanished completely from home cooking. Modern generations often claim to hate lima beans despite never having tasted them, having absorbed cultural dislike passed down from Depression-era parents and grandparents. The vegetables that saved families from starvation became so associated with hard times and forced eating that they were rejected entirely once better options existed. Lima bean and tomato stew has been completely forgotten. Carrot and onion hash transformed two of the cheapest and most available vegetables into a Depression dinner through simple frying technique. Both carrots and onions stored well through winter, remained available year-round, and cost almost nothing even during the hardest economic times. Together, they created a dish that was more flavorful than boiled vegetables while still remaining extremely economical. Making the hash required peeling and dicing carrots into small cubes about 1/4 inch across, onions chopped into similar-sized pieces. The uniform size ensured even cooking. Both vegetables went into a large cast-iron skillet with a small amount of lard, bacon grease, or any other fat the family had. The mixture cooked over medium heat for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, stirring frequently to prevent burning. The long cooking time broke down the carrots until they turned tender and developed brown caramelized edges. The onions, similarly caramelized, turning golden brown and sweet. The frying process concentrated flavors and created complexity that simple boiling never achieved. Salt and pepper provided the only seasonings. Some families added a tiny pinch of sugar, if any remained, to enhance the natural sweetness of caramelizing carrots and onions. The finished hash was orange and golden brown with crispy edges and tender centers. It cost only 10 cents to make enough for a family dinner, making it one of the cheapest possible meals. The dish provided vitamins from carrots, and the caramelization made it taste more interesting than most Depression foods. Children generally tolerated carrot and onion hash better than boiled vegetables because the sweetness and crispy texture appealed to young palates. Families ate this hash as a main dish, sometimes with cornbread on the side if cornmeal was available. The hash was filling enough to satisfy hunger, despite containing no protein or significant calories. The volume of vegetables filled stomachs, even if nutritional value was limited. Carrot and onion hash appeared in Depression cookbooks as economical cooking, and farm wives shared the recipe in rural newspapers and farm journals. The simplicity made it accessible to even inexperienced cooks. The ingredients were reliably available. The result tasted decent. Everything about the dish made it practical Depression food. However, the hash also represented poverty cooking, making do with just vegetables when meat was unaffordable. After the Depression ended and meat returned to American tables, winter radish and potato stew. Winter radish and potato stew used a forgotten vegetable that Depression-era families grew extensively, but modern Americans have never heard of. Winter radishes, and developed thick white or black skin. Cooking the stew required peeling winter radishes to remove the tough outer skin, then chopping them into chunks similar to turnips or potatoes. The radish chunks combined with peeled and diced potatoes, onions, water, salt and pepper in a large pot. Everything simmered together for approximately 45 minutes until both radishes and potatoes turned completely tender. The cooking process mellowed the radish's intense peppery bite into milder, more pleasant flavor. The finished stew was white or pale yellow, depending on radish variety, and tasted peppery, but not overwhelmingly so. It cost approximately 15 cents and provided carbohydrates from potatoes and vitamins from radishes. The peppery flavor made it more interesting than plain potato soup, providing variety in otherwise monotonous Depression diets. However, winter radishes never gained popularity beyond farming communities and immigrant families who brought the tradition from Europe. Most Americans had never heard of cooking radishes at all. The vegetables seemed strange and foreign. After the Depression ended, winter radish cultivation in America nearly ceased. Seed catalogs stopped carrying winter radish varieties. Within one generation, the vegetables disappeared completely from American gardens and markets. Today, almost no Americans have ever seen winter radishes, much less tasted them. The vegetables survive in Asian cuisines. Acorn squash bake. Acorn squash bake represented one of the more pleasant Depression vegetable dinners because acorn squash had natural sweetness that made it enjoyable to eat without added sugar or elaborate preparation. Acorn squash grew abundantly in Depression gardens, producing multiple large squash from each plant. Making the dish required cutting acorn squash in half from stem to bottom, then scooping out the seeds and stringy pulp from the center cavity. The squash halves placed cut side up in a baking pan with a small amount of water in the bottom to prevent burning. Each families added a small spoonful of brown sugar, but many had neither. The squash baked in a moderate oven for approximately 60 to 75 minutes until the flesh turned completely tender and could be easily scooped out with a spoon. The long baking time concentrated the squash's natural sweetness and created soft, almost custard-like texture. The finished squash was orange-yellow inside with sweet, slightly nutty flavor. This bake cost approximately 18 cents because each large acorn squash fed multiple people. The squash provided vitamins, carbohydrates, and enough calories to be filling. Children generally liked acorn squash better than most depression vegetables because of the natural sweetness. The dish felt more like dessert than dinner, making it psychologically more satisfying during times of deprivation. Families ate the squash by scooping the tender flesh directly from the shell, 30 vegetable dinners that kept American families alive through the Great Depression and World War II. Mangelwurzels taken from cattle feed. Vegetable loaves baked like meat. Parsnip casseroles stored through winter. Turnip pies covered with pastry. Root vegetable mixtures thrown together.